All right, joining me now, Dave Cawley, the host of the very popular, well listened to podcast Cold. Dave, I remember when did this first come out? 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, Cold originally came out in November of 2018, so it's been a few years.
2018. And I remember binge listening to it over the holidays around this time of year. But you have some new episodes dropping this week. Tell me about it.
You bet, Nate. So, because we are now at 15 years since Susan Cox Powell was last seen, we looked back at our investigation for the Cold podcast and said, well, what loose ends are there? What can we do to maybe bring Susan's name back up again, look at that case again, talk about the domestic abuse issues that were a main focus for us in Cold Season 1. We settled on these two new bonus episodes that have dropped now into the Cold feed. The first one's called Mystery Metal, and that's an investigation into a piece of evidence that was key to this whole case. A metal object located in a minivan belonging to Susan and her husband Josh the day after Susan went missing. Police and the FBI looked at it. They were never able to figure out what it was. We came up with a theory and we put that to the test in this new bonus episode. Our second new bonus episode is called Beaches and Airplanes, which is a maybe strange name for a true crime podcast episode. But what it does is it looks at a forensic interview from Charlie Powell, Susan's 4-year-old son. He gave this interview the day after Susan disappeared, and he talked about going camping with his dad out in Utah's West Desert and his mom going camping with them, but not coming home. He said that they had visited a place with crystals. And then he also said he had gone on an airplane and to the beach. So a lot of people focused on crystals when the Susan Powell story was originally unfolding, wondering where he was talking about. We now kind of go the other way and say, all right, can we decipher what he meant by beaches and airplanes? Those are our two new bonus episodes.
Wow. Okay. So I'm sure since these dropped over the past several years, you've gotten a lot of tips. How do you sort out like the legitimate ones versus, okay, this is nothing?
Ooh, that's a really good question.
Because you could probably spend all day chasing down everybody's theories on this case.
Including my own, let's be honest, right?
Right.
If you spend enough time looking at the case, or any case really, you'll come up with ideas. Uh, Vetting information is difficult. And we can see that when we look at the Susan Powell case files. The police faced this problem. They had hundreds of tips over the course of their investigation. And if you read through those, a lot of them are clearly just not relevant. A lot of them are, I would say, well intentioned. They're people who think they have information to share, but once you really get into looking at them, maybe it's a hunch or it's somebody who has a feeling, it's a psychic thing. I'm not here to tell anybody what to believe or not believe, but I take a more scientific approach to it. I'll listen to anybody who says they have information, but then I'm going to go back and try to put that together with the facts that we know. Does it match the timeline? Can I place Josh Powell where somebody says they might have seen him, something like that? And over the course of time, there have been some valuable tips that have come into us at Cold that I believe have advanced the investigation beyond where it was when law enforcement essentially put it down in 2013. That being said, had a lot of tips that don't take us anywhere. So, I again try to take a scientific approach to it, think about what can be verified and is there something actionable here? If somebody says, I think you might be able to find Susan in Southeast Idaho. Great. There's a lot of space in Southeast Idaho. Can you be more specific? Can you put us in a more focused area? And if they can, we'll go search.
There was, though, or when we spoke before about this, you believe that there could be an Idaho tie in Southeast Idaho. For those people that may not be familiar with that, what can you share about that?
Yeah, I still believe that, Nate. We're looking at a situation where in the days after Susan Powell disappeared, police put a GPS tracker on Josh Powell's minivan. Before he took off in that minivan, he disappeared for 18 hours in a rental car. And we know that when he returned that rental car, there were 807 miles placed on it. So that's a lot of mileage to drive in a short amount of time. Josh Powell didn't have his cell phone. He didn't use a credit card during that time, but he picked up a burner phone, probably paying cash, and that activated as he was coming southbound on I-15 through Tremonton. So that would suggest that he had been maybe up in Idaho and he was coming back into Utah during those 18 hours. Fast forward about 10 days, Josh Powell's back in his minivan. The GPS tracker is on it. He's now leaving Utah to move to Washington to go live with his dad and basically escape police here in Utah. He's doing this drive in the middle of the night, and the GPS tracker shows he stopped by the side of I-84 in between Twin Falls and Mountain Home alongside a canal. And he was there for 5-10 minutes. What he was doing there, we don't know. Was he taking a bathroom break on the side of the highway? Maybe, but it sure is suspicious to me that he would stop there at 2 a.m. for 10 minutes and then continue on his way up the road. And the GPS tracker shows that he went to sleep at a rest area. So we can't explain that. That canal has been looked at, searched. We haven't located any evidence, but there again, you had moving water that flowed through that canal within, a couple of months after that time. So any evidence might have been washed away. We don't know.
I remember you telling me about an encrypted hard drive. Has there been any progress on getting into that hard drive?
The encrypted hard drive remains like one of the most frustrating parts of this investigation, Nate, because I think a lot of people who don't understand even the basics of digital forensics, they think, well, AI should be able to solve this, or quantum computing should be able to solve this. But the truth of the matter is, if encryption was easily breakable, crackable, none of our private information, credit card information, bank information, health information, none of that would be safe, right? We, as a society, rely on strong encryption protecting private information. Josh Powell was not a cryptographer. He wasn't somebody who was coming up with his own encryption algorithms, but he knew how to use the tools that were available to encrypt his digital information. And that encryption is just as secure today as it was 5 years ago, as it was 15 years ago.
Mm.
So we know that, since my work with the Cold Podcast, there was a renewed effort by some of these digital forensics experts to try new tools, to try new approaches to breaking into that. And it unfortunately remains locked away from our view.
Shoot, do you think they'll ever be able to crack it?
I would be surprised based on what I know of how Josh approached encrypting his information. He was using tools that are largely gone. So for example, he used a program called Cypress. Cypress has not been in development. It has not been available for 10-ish years, 12 years. And because of that, it's not a high level target for the people who make tools that try to crack encryption. All of that means that there's not any active work going on toward cracking that style of encryption. It leaves me with a pretty dim view of the likelihood of us ever, brute forcing or using those kinds of tools to get into it. It would require, I think, some kind of human break, finding a note, a scrap of paper where he wrote a password, something like that to get around that encryption.
Yeah. So you've got the big question on what's on that hard drive, also the big question on where is Susan and what happened to her. What other questions do you still have, having devoted so much time to this over the past decade or so?
For me, it goes back to what was Josh's original plan, because I think what I saw from my investigation of the Susan Powell case was it was a premeditated act of violence. Josh Powell had thought, I think, for a long time about getting rid of Susan and cashing in on her $1 million life insurance policy. He took steps to establish methods to get that money if she were to disappear. But whatever his plan was, the day that Susan disappeared, it was interrupted, and he was then having to basically improvise. I don't yet have a really clear understanding of what his original intent was. And so part of the effort with these 2 new bonus episodes is to work around that idea, work around that problem. What was Josh's mindset? He bought this oxyacetylene torch a week before Susan disappeared. What did he want it for? He said it was for making jewelry, but then he bought a kit that was more equipped toward cutting steel. People have speculated he was maybe planning to use that to cut open grates on mine shafts. There's no evidence that he ever used it that way, but he had a plan. What was that plan? I don't know, and I would like to know.
Yeah. 15 years, man, a lot can happen over 15 years. Can you believe it's been that long?
Time flies is all I can say to that, Nate. I remember covering the case when it was originally happening. I was a radio reporter, working in West Valley, the same place that Susan disappeared from. So it hit pretty close to home for me. And, I think there was an expectation back at that time that police would quickly solve the case, that Susan would be found. The fact that here we are 15 years later, still talking about it, still having these questions, it's frustrating. And at the same time, I've worked on other cases, cold cases that are 40, 50 years old. And the challenges of breaking a case, the older it gets, they just increase. The window of time for us to find recoverable remains for Susan, it's starting to close that window. So I hope that we're not here in another 5 years talking about the case just the same way we are today. But I think it's going to take a pretty big stroke of luck to advance us to the point where we can find Susan.
So remind me, Dave, you were reporting for KSL News Radio when she disappeared, and then it was big in the news. And then, from my recollection, it kind of died off. It kind of went cold after Josh Powell killed himself and the children. And then, 2018, you kind of dropped this podcast out there. Did you how much time of your personal time before all this did you spend on this, on the podcast?
Personal time, I
Or
couldn't
time in
even.
general, I guess I should say. I mean,
Sure.
were you since 2015 like I want to stay on this, or did you wait a few years to pick it back up again and really dive in?
So how that kind of played out for me was in 2009, I was working for the company today is iHeart. It was Clear Channel at the time. I came to work for KSL in 2012,
Oh,
just
okay.
a few weeks after Josh Powell ended his life and the lives of his children up in Washington State. So I changed employers during that time, but I was covering it through that whole period. Josh Powell's brother, Michael, ended his life in 2013, and that came as a complete shock. I was sitting at a desk right behind me here when that word came down, and we continued to follow the events in Washington State where Josh Powell's dad, Steve Powell, stood trial for child pornography and voyeurism charges, went to prison. So this was continuing to unfold. But you're right, the actual West Valley City Police investigation basically ended in 2013. I was reading through the case files that they released at that time and kept just finding references to interesting things that had not been made public. For me, the big tipping point was, I think in 2015-ish, I find this reference to Josh Powell audio journals in the police case files. Those had never been released. There was really no information about what they were. So I did some public records work with the West Valley City Police Department to get access to those because I was curious, what was Josh talking about in his audio journals? And that really became the seed that grew into the Cold Podcast. So from 2014, 2015 up until 2018, when we released, it was largely a project that I was doing at home. I was, producing radio every day, and then I would go home and I'd sit down with that case file. I'd sit down with those audio journals, listen with those headphones on, try to piece together this story. And as you know, from all of the coverage that you've done on the big cases in Idaho, the more you dig, the more you find to chase, right? Other people that, you want to talk to, and it just grows and grows and grows. So at some point I came back to my bosses at KSL and I said, look, I'm digging into this story. There's more here than we've ever heard. There's a narrative about the abusive relationship that Susan was stuck in that people don't know. What are we going to do with that? Let's maybe try to put it into a podcast, put context around it, tell the story from beginning to end. So that's kind of how the Cold Podcast came to be.
Which is impressive. And the fact too, this was really the true crime genre of podcasts, and really podcasts in general. Was it kind of in its infancy days back when you dropped this?
It's funny. People ask that question. I think crime coverage in journalism, it goes back long before the invention of podcasting. Certainly, the arrival of serial on the scene changed the way a lot of people thought about narrative audio storytelling, especially around crime. Uh, Cold came out a few years after that. So we were certainly on the crest, I would say, of that wave. I would like to think that Cold does what a lot of true crime content doesn't do, which is roots itself very deeply in the journalism. I think there's a lot of people who want to talk about crime. They want to, gab about cases. And if that's what you like to listen to, no judgment. That's not the kind of storytelling I want to invest in. So Cold really for me is it's investigative, it's journalistic, also with a deep sense of sensitivity to the people whose lives were affected by these crimes.
Right. Yeah, that is the truth. There's so many podcasts out there that people can just listen to where they just talk about cases, but you have done the work for sure. Plus, if I recall, on every episode or most episode, you offer resources for people in domestic abuse situations. There's kind of an underlying purpose through all of it.
You're 100% correct there, Nate. And with our 15-year coverage here at KSL today and this weekend, that's been a big focus of conversation with our team, the Cold team, and with the broader KSL newsroom is how do we make sure that the stories we're telling are empowering people who are experiencing domestic abuse right now to get help, right? Because yes, there's the part of the Susan Powell story that is that question of where is Susan? Can we find Susan? Can we unravel what Josh did? But to me, the bigger purpose is okay, people who are listening to this story, people who are seeing it on television, they know somebody who is going through an abusive relationship, or they may be in an abusive relationship themselves. And if we're not helping them find the tools, the resources to safely get out of those kinds of relationships, then we're not doing our jobs. I feel that pretty strong.
Yeah. All right, Dave. So where can people find the new episodes?
The great news is Cold right now is available anywhere you get your podcasts for free. A lot of people who listen to the Susan Powell story also might not realize we have two other seasons. So Cold seasons 1, 2, and 3 available anywhere you get your podcasts. If you're not an avid podcast listener, I would say A, why not? B, you can just go to thecoldpodcast.com and listen to all of our episodes there.
If you're not an avid podcast listener, this is the podcast. I kid you not. This was like the very first podcast I ever listened to, Cold Season 1, the Susan Powell thing. You said that you can listen to them all, not just the new episodes for free. Like you can listen to you can go back and binge it.
Yeah, so a lot of people that listened to Cold Season 1 and then tried to listen to Cold Season 2, that for a time was locked up on the Amazon Music or the Wondery platform. I know that was a frustration for listeners. That is not the case anymore. So again, all those episodes, season 1, I mean, I don't want to just turn this into a self-promotional pitch, but if it's been 5 or 6 years since you listened, I'm hearing a lot of people are going back and re-listening at this 15-year mark to the whole thing. So you can go binge season 1 again, or as I said, seasons two and 3 also freely available anywhere you like to listen.
All right. You can self-promote all you want, Dave. It's okay.
I appreciate it.
All right. Listen to Cold. Thank you so much. Can't wait to listen to it.